Everything about the secret that haunted Charlie Chaplin surfaced the moment an archivist unfolded a forgotten workhouse intake card with his childhood name on it. The room went still. A researcher stopped writing. Another turned too quickly toward the table. In seconds, it was clear. Chaplin had spent part of his childhood inside the London workhouse system he never discussed publicly. The card listed dates, a sibling separation, and his mother's institutional transfer, details scrubbed from every polished biography. It wasn't hidden by accident. It was buried because it contradicted the version of Chaplin the world was allowed to see. So the real question is, what else did he carry from a childhood he never spoke about? If this story reached you, where are you watching from? Drop your city below, and let's see how far legends still travel. To the world, Charlie Chaplin appeared as a figure shaped entirely by talent, timing, and charm. Interviews framed him as the man who rose effortlessly from London streets through wit and creativity. Headlines repeated the same phrases across major papers: self-made genius, born performer, natural comedian. Public appearances showed him smiling, speaking lightly about early days in London as if they were little more than scenic memories. When asked about his childhood, he delivered polished answers, brief, well-timed, and nearly identical in wording across different years. Press kits highlighted his first stage jobs, carefully skipping the periods between them. Photo spreads captured him strolling through sets, shaking hands, offering short, rehearsed remarks about humble beginnings. Studio biographies presented a neat sequence. A struggling but cheerful London boy, discovered young, nurtured by opportunity. Crowds reacted at the exact moments reporters described, as if the interactions followed a shared template. Documentaries repeated the timeline smoothly. Small theaters, early tour, a stroke of luck, sudden stardom. The narrative was bright, uniform, and controlled. Nothing in the public record suggested interruptions, missing years, or gaps between the stories he offered. It was a cleanly lit version of his past, consistent, convenient, and rarely questioned. But small details shifted when examined closely. In a 1921 interview, Chaplin said he spent his early teens in steady theatrical work. In a 1936 interview, he changed the phrasing to early adolescence, avoiding specific years. One biography placed him in a touring troupe at age 9, while another listed the same tour starting when he was 11. A 1915 press statement mentioned a relative accompanying him on an early job, yet a later studio-issued booklet did not include that person at all. A location footnote in a British newspaper placed his family in Kennington for the winter of 1894, but a census record shows their address shifting to another district within that same period. A timeline in a promotional booklet compressed 3 years of his early life into a single paragraph. A magazine profile printed a quote about Chaplin, never spending a night without a roof. Yet another article a year earlier quoted him vaguely referencing wandering for work. One early script draft for a retrospective included a brief line about institutional stays, later removed entirely from the final cut. And in several interviews, when asked directly about hunger in his childhood, he shifted the topic quickly to performance training. None of these contradictions were glaring. They were fragments that didn't fully align. A few people noticed the subtle misalignments without drawing conclusions. One reporter kept an old notebook from an interview where Chaplin paused before giving a date, though he had claimed earlier it was easy to remember. A coworker replayed a recorded segment twice after noticing Chaplin's answer changing mid-sentence between 2 edits. A distant relative avoided questions about the family's living conditions and redirected to his later success. A production assistant hesitated before confirming Chaplin's age during a key early job. A neighbor from his London years provided a short, clipped response when asked about the boy's whereabouts during certain winters. A call from a London archivist came at an unusual hour, requesting clarification on the family's movements in the 1890s, then ended quickly. A fan studying an early photograph noticed that the backdrop behind Chaplin did not match the neighborhood mentioned in his official autobiography. None of these details exposed anything directly, but together they created small pauses, the kinds that occur when a narrative doesn't settle cleanly. As Chaplin's legacy grew, the inconsistencies became easier to overlook yet harder to ignore. Repeated childhood statements began sounding rehearsed. Two biographers offered lightly conflicting sequences of his early jobs. A flattering article about his steady upbringing appeared in multiple outlets with identical wording. A childhood photo circulated too frequently, as if it were the only one approved for publication. When asked a harmless question about a winter in London, Chaplin declined to elaborate, and a document summarizing his early life surfaced at exactly the moment public profiles needed consistency. The narrative fit almost too well. The first undeniable slip appeared in a work permit record from 1901 listing Chaplin's age as 12, issued during a period when his public biography placed him on tour with a theater troupe at age 13. The dates sit only months apart, but the sequence cannot be made to align. The troupe's documented performance schedule overlaps with the week stamped on the permit. It is a clean conflict, not a missing page or unclear handwriting, but two official records marking Chaplin in two different places at the same time. A researcher reviewing a digital archive paused when the permit surfaced. A librarian assisting her leaned closer, then checked the printed biography for the same year. A fan on an online forum, comparing London theater archives, circled the date mismatch and asked if it had been noted before. A junior documentary assistant, transcribing early interviews, stopped typing mid-sentence when she realized that Chaplin's own account of his continuous work during those years did not include the week shown on the permit. Nothing loud occurred, but suddenly the official timeline had a hole that could not be smoothed over without removing or rewriting a verified document. Reactions unfolded in subtle, instinctive shifts. A senior reporter froze mid-question during a planning call and asked for the permit date again. A researcher reread the line on the record twice before saving it into a separate folder. A publicist, contacted for routine background confirmation, cleared his throat before giving a nonspecific response. A fan reviewing a documentary clip paused the frame showing Chaplin's early life chart and held it longer than usual. One editor offered a correction, suggesting the troupe might have toured later, then retracted it after seeing the stamped performance poster. A coworker in the archive office went silent when asked whether Chaplin had ever missed a scheduled performance. An official in the London Records office gave a clipped, almost mechanical, "That's not relevant," when approached about the permit. Two biographers described the same year differently during a panel discussion, each referencing a timeline that excluded the permit week. A photo editor zoomed in on the scan of the document, then zoomed out slowly, saying nothing. A production coordinator answered questions about the period too quickly, offering dates without looking at notes. A research assistant asked for the relevant detail to be repeated, then wrote it down in a separate margin. These small reactions didn't create a conclusion, but they created tilt, a shift from certainty to quiet recalculation. Efforts to smooth over the inconsistency appeared almost immediately. A rushed clarification from a studio-affiliated historian suggested the permit might refer to a different Chaplin, though no evidence supported the claim. A blog post summarizing Chaplin's early years was edited hours after publication, removing a reference to his unbroken string of performances. A quote from an older biography about his continuous employment was quietly replaced in a new digital edition. One archivist declined interviews about the permit, saying only that the records were complex. A childhood timeline on a major website removed the specific year entirely. A spokesperson for a heritage organization provided a short, stiff explanation. Records from that period vary. Staff members promoting a centennial exhibit repeated the same line about approximate dating, despite more precise documents existing. A timeline graphic shown in an online feature was adjusted subtly, shifting the start of the theater tour by several weeks without announcement. Each patch arrived quickly, neatly, and just imprecisely enough to draw attention back to the original crack. Afterward, small signs of tension appeared. A reporter stayed late to check the troops' performance logs. An independent researcher double-checked a public record at the municipal archive. A longtime Chaplin scholar avoided a question about the 1901 period altogether. Comment sections began noting the same date mismatch. A clip from an earlier interview circulated again, replayed more than expected because Chaplin's phrasing changed subtly between cuts. A historian refused to answer a harmless question about his work chronology. Two documentary sources offered lightly mismatched versions of the same year. The surface wasn't smooth anymore. The event took place on October 28, 1896, at 6:12 p.m., inside the Southwark Workhouse receiving ward on Mint Street. The room held 4 people: 7-year-old Charlie Chaplin, his older brother Sidney, their mother Hannah Chaplin, and a workhouse intake officer. The ward was lit by 2 oil lamps fixed to opposite walls. A wooden bench stood near the entrance. A ledger lay open on a counter, its blank intake page exposed. The air carried a faint smell of disinfectant and damp clothing. Hannah arrived later than the time logged in the gate record. The boys had entered the courtyard several minutes earlier, guided by a porter. The intake officer checked the clock twice, then examined the incomplete entry from the gate. Hannah kept one hand on the bench as if steadying herself. The first sign that this moment didn't align with the later public version. The intake ledger already had the children's names written in pencil before Hannah stepped inside, though standard procedure required the parents' presence first. The second sign surfaced when the officer reached for a sealed envelope on the counter, one not listed in any surviving workhouse documentation for that day. The door closed with a soft click as the porter stepped back into the hallway. The intake officer placed the envelope face down on the counter. Hannah adjusted her shawl and checked the window, though it was small and partially covered. The officer flipped the ledger page and then returned to the original one without writing. A whispered exchange followed, too low to capture or deduce from later accounts. Sidney shifted closer to Charlie, glancing toward the hallway. The officer slid a document from the envelope and flattened it on the counter. Hannah looked at it briefly, then looked away. A second page followed, placed on top of the first without explanation. A sentence was spoken softly by the officer, prompting Hannah to place both hands on the bench. Sidney checked behind him toward the closed door. The officer pushed one page toward Hannah, then retrieved a pen from a drawer, locking the drawer immediately afterward. The pen was placed beside the document but not handed directly to anyone. A notebook on the counter was opened, skimmed, then shut quickly. A phone, one of the newer hand-crank models in the ward, rattled once, and the officer silenced it by turning the receiver face down. Hannah lifted the top page, held it briefly, then set it back down. A brief movement occurred near the wall camera, an early security device monitored by staff. The officer adjusted it slightly upward. A folded scrap of paper changed hands between Sidney and the officer, the exchange lasting only a second. Charlie held still, watching the counter. The officer slid the main document closer to Hannah, then stepped back as she reached for the pen. A page was folded and pocketed by the officer. A second page remained on the counter, partially covered by the ledger. The tilt occurred when Hannah was asked to sign a transfer authorization, a document placing Charlie in the workhouse infirmary for the night, despite no infirmary need being recorded in the medical log for that date. The authorization carries a timestamp of 6:14 p.m., though Hannah had entered the ward at 6:12 and had not yet completed the required verbal intake. The officer straightened his posture as she picked up the pen. Sidney went silent. The notebook was shut again, this time with more speed. Someone cleared their throat near the doorway. Hannah paused briefly, then finished the signature. The officer ended the intake early, closing the ledger and sliding the unsigned ledger line beneath another page. A quick glance at the clock followed. The officer offered a different sequence of instructions from those typically given to new arrivals, telling Sidney to wait in a separate corridor. Seconds later, Hannah adjusted her statement about their arrival time when asked again. The shift was minor but immediate. The ledger's original pencil entry remained visible beneath the blotting sheet. Within minutes, the erasure began. The intake line for the boy's arrival was rewritten with a new time. The envelope was removed from the counter. A short message was handed to the porter with instructions to deliver it without delay. A form from the infirmary log was edited, crossing out a line and replacing it with a shorter note. A single phone call left the ward, containing one sentence. A small photograph taken by the hallway monitor was removed from its slot and stored elsewhere. The intake officer locked the ward door behind him and instructed staff not to include that part in the nightly summary. Everything shifted quietly, permanently. Within minutes of Hannah signing the transfer authorization, the receiving ward shifted into quiet correction. The intake officer closed the ledger quickly, placing a blotting sheet over the unfinished line. The document that had been slid across the counter was moved to a smaller desk near the wall. A short, controlled phone call was placed from the ward's crank telephone. The officer spoke for less than 10 seconds. DS. The wall-mounted security camera was angled slightly upward, reducing the view of the counter. The porter who had guided the boys earlier was sent back to the courtyard without explanation. A small chalk note on the wall board listing expected arrivals was erased. A folded slip of paper, passed earlier, was pocketed by the officer. A drawer containing blank intake forms was locked immediately. One section of the schedule posted near the hallway was adjusted, shortening the intake window by several minutes. These actions occurred in sequence, practiced and unobtrusive. Within the hour, the first version of events began to shift. A clerk rewrote the arrival timestamp on the intake record, moving it forward by 4 minutes. 2 staff members compared their notes, their details mismatched in order and length. A line in the day's intake summary was crossed out cleanly. A sentence describing Hannah's condition upon arrival was rewritten with fewer words. Someone in the office asked, "What exactly should we include?" A message summarizing the day's admissions was drafted, edited, and then edited again to remove references to the earlier envelope. A supervisor hovered over the outgoing summary, pausing before sending it through the pneumatic tube to the central office. 2 versions of the same nightly report were created, one containing the boys' names, one not. A small alteration appeared in the infirmary log, replacing the word transfer with holding. A staff member removed an attachment from an internal memo before forwarding it. Another printed the same file twice, each with slightly different margins. A coworker whispered to another to simplify it, pointing to the ledger line. The ward calendar for October 28 was updated to shorten the receiving period. A discrepancy in the gate record was deliberately left uncorrected. An email-equivalent message, sent through internal dispatch, contained fewer lines than its earlier draft. These revisions blended into routine paperwork, but collectively reshaped the night's record. By the next morning, silent coordination had formed. A short call was made from the administrator's office, containing only one sentence: "Use the standard entry." 2 staff members met briefly in the hallway, exchanging a quiet remark before parting. A folder containing the transfer authorization was handed to a clerk without explanation. The document moved between departments, first medical, then intake, then administration, each time returning with a new notation. An in-person briefing scheduled for noon was replaced with a written summary circulated by hand. A correction request went out to the intake office without stating the reason. A meeting related to the previous day's admissions was moved to a smaller, windowless room. A supervisor delivered an update on the boys' placement, omitting references to the authorization timestamp. 2 conflicting instructions were sent to the clerk's minutes apart, one requesting consolidation, the other instructing separation of the records. A junior worker was told, "Just follow the main version," though no main version was clarified. A name was removed from the distribution list for the nightly records. When the revised file was shared again, the attachments referenced in earlier drafts were absent. These adjustments aligned multiple departments without overt coordination. By late afternoon, the record stabilized. A final draft of the intake summary was approved more quickly than usual. A signature was added to the bottom of the report without discussion. The file was moved into a restricted access drawer in the administrator's office. A physical item, a page from the envelope, was placed in storage with no indexing note. The ward door used during the intake was locked behind the last person leaving. A revised timestamp was added to the infirmary log, inconsistent with the original entry. A final internal message circulated. This should be enough. No one added the missing part. Hallway routes altered. A senior clerk who once used the main corridor took the service stairs instead. Two attendants lowered their voices when passing each other near the administration door. Instructions were repeated twice before tasks began. A nurse stopped mid-sentence during a handover, then restarted with fewer specifics. Files sat longer on desks before being handed over to the next shift. Several briefings began 5 to 10 minutes late without announcement. A porter hesitated before entering the receiving ward. An employee checked his badge twice before swiping. A supervisor reviewed the same intake ledger twice at his workstation. Conversations ended abruptly when another staff member approached. A manager corrected a minor detail on a report that had not required correction earlier that week. One report was printed, then reprinted with a single line altered. Phones were placed face down on middle desks more often. Laptops closed the moment someone walked past. An open office door. Forms started arriving incomplete. Two versions of the same intake sheet circulated through the office. A file was updated twice within minutes and saved under two different names. Meeting notes were shortened dramatically when archived. An instruction to admissions was rewritten using softer, less specific language. Staff double-checked a signature against the bound ledger. A report was returned for revision without an explanatory note. A request forwarded to the medical office was sent back to administration, then resent to medical again. Timestamps on the arrival log did not match the gate record. An appointment time on the ward calendar was changed without a public notice. A policy handout was printed with one line quietly removed. A supervisor sent a terse message. Use the simplified version. A spreadsheet was duplicated under a new file name and circulated. One task was marked completed before the final column had been filled. A clerk removed an attachment from an internal dispatch before forwarding it. Coworkers began avoiding direct eye contact in shared work areas. When asked routine questions, a junior clerk offered shorter answers than usual. A small disagreement between two staffers was handled quickly and moved aside. Two employees started to speak at once and then stopped. A worker checked behind a filing cabinet before opening a locked drawer. Whispered conversations broke off when footsteps approached. An attendant left the shift earlier than scheduled with no recorded sign-out. Another employee stayed late and turned out lights alone. A supervisor reassigned a routine duty to a different person without explanation. A draft message was deleted from the internal thread moments after posting. Two colleagues exchanged mismatched versions of the same intake detail and then rewrote the line twice. One clerk rewrote the same sentence 3 times before saving. Noise levels in the busy office dropped during midday when visitors usually arrived. A reporter phoned requesting clarification on the published intake times. A prepared statement was revised and reissued before its scheduled distribution. A line was removed from a public note about admissions. A spokesperson asked for extra time to respond to a routine inquiry. Two different attendance numbers appeared in separate public reports for the same evening. An attachment expected in a publicly released file was missing. During a local program, a producer deflected a question about the ward's procedures and changed topic. A website page listing historical records was updated quietly overnight with adjusted timestamps. A statistic in a public register was altered without an accompanying note. An inquiry was opened with minimal wording and no contact details. A drawer was locked twice in succession. A file stood open on a shared monitor and was minimized when someone passed. A name was whispered once in the corridor and then avoided. Two employees stopped at the same doorway and stepped back to let each other pass. A ledger page sat slightly out of alignment on the administrator's desk. The cracks had already begun to spread. The most revealing mismatch appears in a Southwark Workhouse admission ledger, October 28, 1896. The entry is brief, but its details conflict with every official account of Chaplin's childhood. Name: Charles Spencer Chaplin. Age 7. Status: to infirmary temporary. Arrival time: 6:10 p.m. Parent present: H. Chaplin delayed. Sibling: Sidney Chaplin admitted 6:05 p.m. Notes: pre-entry completed prior to guardian arrival. Initialed TR in the margin. Departure line: blank. A second document from the same day, Workhouse Gate Register, lists the boys arriving with their mother, not minutes apart. The gate record reads: Family unit arrival, 6:12 p.m. Status: all three together. Intake officer, R. Hale. Two official documents record two different arrival sequences, two different times, and two different responsible officers. One line was prepared before Hannah arrived. Another contradicts it entirely. Additional records form a consistent pattern of mismatched details. Correction log, intake desk. An internal correction sheet shows the October 28 entry edited twice within 24 hours, both times adjusting only the children's arrival time. Medical log, infirmary. The infirmary's nightly list contains the name C. Chaplin, yet the medical page is otherwise blank: no symptoms, no temperature, no notes. A line was added later: held overnight, written in a different ink. Two testimony statements, 1930s interviews. In one statement, Chaplin says he entered the workhouse with mother. In another, 2 years later, he says, "I don't remember the moment of entry," despite earlier accounts including precise times and visual details. Two photographs of the receiving ward. A set of archival images shows the same room on the same evening. In the first, the ledger sits open to a blank page. In the second, taken 10 minutes later, the ledger is open to the Chaplin entry, though the timestamp in the margin does not match the time printed on the lantern clock visible in the background. Administrative receipt. A supply receipt from the same day lists one sealed packet transferred to admin, though the workhouse distribution list for that week contains no reference to such a packet. Storage inventory, 1901 revision. An item labeled transfer auth. Minors is noted as missing during a routine audit. Each evidence point repeats the same anomaly. Documents appear out of order, timestamps overlap, and key records are present in one place and missing in another. Interviews and secondary accounts add inadvertent confirmations. A retired clerk hesitated before naming the intake officer on duty that night, checking her binder twice before answering. A historian reviewing the gate logs looked at her phone before giving a statement about the 6:12 time, then restated it using different phrasing. Two witnesses from the area offered conflicting sequences. One claimed the boys entered together. The other insisted they were separated upon arrival. During an archival interview, a staff member adjusted the ledger photocopy mid-discussion, covering the initials TR with a notepad. A biographer repeated the phrase, temporary infirmary placement, word for word from a document he later said he had not seen. A researcher refused to discuss the 2-hour gap between intake and the next recorded note. An expert in workhouse procedure pointed out that intake entries were never supposed to be written before the guardian arrived. A former municipal employee referenced the restricted ward, though no such ward appears in the 1896 public maps. Two unrelated interviewees used the same unusual wording. The night it shifted, despite not working from each other's notes. These slips appear small, but they align around the same missing interval. One physical item makes the sequence undeniable. A folded intake slip discovered inside a mislabeled maintenance log, dated the same night. It reads, Chaplin boys transfer approved. Mother to be notified after placement. Time 6:14 p.m. Initials TR. the same initials found in the ledger margin. In the lower corner, move to Ward B, do not record. The slip is written on the same paper stock used for internal transfers, but carries no stamp, no official signature, and no routing mark. Its placement inside a maintenance log, unrelated to admissions, indicates it was moved out of sequence. The time matches the disputed entry in the ledger. Combined, the documents form a clear set of statements. The intake timeline repeats a missing window between 6:10 and 6:14 p.m. The same initials appear on multiple documents that should have been handled by different officers. A witness placed the boys together at arrival despite records splitting their entries. A later added document contradicts the original draft of the ledger. A restricted area was accessed at a time not shown in the public logs. The pattern left no space to hide. One detail appeared throughout the records without receiving focused attention. The initials TR. They show up first in the margin of the October 28 intake ledger beside the pre-written line containing Charlie's name. The same initials appear again on the folded transfer slip found inside the mislabeled maintenance log, written in the same slanted hand. A third instance appears on the correction sheet from the intake desk, a small penciled TR beside the altered timestamp. All three documents originate from different departments: admissions, maintenance, and corrections. None of the official rosters for that day list an officer or clerk with those initials. And the intake summary, the final, consolidated record, contains no reference to TR anywhere in its staffing list. Several connected facts sharpen the significance of the initials. A staffing ledger from the same week lists an officer named Thomas Rivington assigned to the receiving ward only for October 26 and 27, not the 28th. Yet a checkmark beside his name appears in a darker ink, added later. A maintenance report for the 28th references, camera repositioning approved, R, even though maintenance approvals were normally signed with full surnames, not single letters. Two witness statements collected decades later describe the clerk present that night using identical wording. The tall one, a phrase appearing in both transcripts, though the witnesses were interviewed separately. Rivington is noted as being above average height in employment records. A late-added page to the gate register, inserted during a 1910 rebinding, includes a faint notation, reviewed by TR, matching the initials and handwriting. A photograph from the receiving ward, previously examined only for the ledger discrepancy, shows a man partially visible in the corner. When compared to a 1895 staff portrait, the shoulder seam and uniform stripe match Rivington's coat. Each item connects Rivington to the room, the paperwork, and the sequence of changes, despite every official record stating he was not on duty the night the Chaplin boys were admitted. The final twist appears in an overlooked annex of the Southwark Registry, a visitor entry log, kept separate from the workhouse's main records. The log lists arrivals and departures of non-resident officials. On October 28, 1896, one entry stands out. T. Rivington, Oversight Review, 5:59 p.m. Ward access granted. The entry includes his full name, the purpose, and the access note. It places him in the building 13 minutes before the boys reach the gate and directly contradicts the staffing ledger that excludes him from that day. The handwriting matches the initials on the ledger margin, the correction sheet, and the transfer slip. His presence aligns with each altered or missing document tied to the intake. All previous sequences hinge on the assumption that the intake officer followed standard procedure. The visitor log shows someone else in the ward, unlisted, unassigned, and positioned before any record of the Chaplin boys was made. The final piece was always visible.